Chairman Tonko, Ranking Member Shimkus, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the AFL-CIO on this legislation to ban asbestos. My full written testimony has been submitted to the committee for the record. The AFL-CIO is a federation of 55 national and international unions, and we represent more than 12.5 million union members who work side by side millions of non-unionized workers. Over the last 4 decades, the AFL-CIO and our affiliated unions have acted to protect workers from the hazards of asbestos exposure through the development and implementation of asbestos regulations and legislation. We strongly support this federal legislation to ban asbestos, H.R. 1603. We applaud the efforts of Representative Bonamici and this committee to champion and guide this legislation in the House, and the efforts of Senator Merkley to initiate similar legislation in the Senate. Asbestos is the poster child of the historical failure under the original Toxic Substance Control Act to protect people from a chemical known to have very serious health effects at very low levels of exposure and known to be extremely difficult to control over its long lifespan. In the development of the 2016 bipartisan Frank-Lautenberg Act, no one doubted its aim to fix the law to ban asbestos definitively. But we are here today because EPA has not used that new authority and responsibility, and we are here to further amend that law to finally protect working people and to save lives. One of the worst things about asbestos is that most people think it is no longer a problem in the U.S., when in fact it is the most significant and devastating occupational health disaster that has lasted over a century in this country. Hundreds of thousands have died. The number of asbestos-related deaths that continue today are worse than experts in the 1980s projected them to be now. Tens of thousands each year. The number of mesothelioma cases in 2017 is actually the highest number of the data that is pulled since 1999. Especially troubling, we're seeing workers under the age of 55 with significant levels of asbestos disease and are dying. And those are workers who have entered the job market after the 1980s and after asbestos regulations were adopted. An insulator in Chicago started the trade in 1993 and was screened in 2016. He recently died at the age of 45 with elevated levels of asbestos fibers in his lungs. The legacy of asbestos, unfortunately, is very much with us, and we are passing it on to the next generation. As other industrialized countries are realizing the magnitude of this continuing exposures and disease from legacy asbestos, the asbestos installed 40 to 70 years ago, they are not only banning asbestos from commerce, they are also conducting national assessments to understand where it is, how much of it there is, and they're developing strategic plans to safely remove it and dispose of it. But in the US, we don't really know that information. And if we don't know, we can't control exposures to it. Workers don't know if they are repairing or installing something located next to asbestos materials. They don't know if they are replacing flooring containing asbestos. The last time the US has profiled the scope of the asbestos problem was in the 1980s, despite its widespread existence throughout facilities all over the country, in refineries, in powerhouses, in schools, in hospitals, in steel factories, and in other structures. That material installed decades ago is now falling apart and being disturbed. As asbestos ages and weathers different conditions, such as moisture, vibration, it deteriorates and it becomes friable over time, which puts those working near it at much higher risk. The worst occupational exposures tend to be in construction, abatement, renovation, routine maintenance work, and custodial activities, but because there's no safe level of exposure to asbestos, any worker performing activities near asbestos is at risk. In its 1994 asbestos standard, OSHA recognized and fully acknowledged that under the standard, workers exposed to continue to be at significant risk of asbestos disease. Instead of banning all new uses of asbestos and conducting a full assessment to understand the real magnitude and the real impact of the problem, EPA recently created a mechanism for the agency to actually approve new uses of asbestos. They've misled the public by telling us that they are strengthening regulation of asbestos. The legislation here today is so important. It bans future uses of asbestos without loopholes, and it begins the very difficult and critical work of controlling the problem in front of us, the deadly consequences of legacy uses. OSHA cannot do this. EPA has not done this. We urge the committee and Congress to move forward without delay and enact this life-saving bill. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Reindel.